right. Well, welcome everyone. Good afternoon if you are here in DC or East Coast time. Welcome to today's national webinar and congressional briefing of the Coalition to Advance Maternal Therapeutics, addressing concerns and considerations surrounding the inclusion of pregnant and lactating populations in research. My name is Catherine Schubert. I'm the president and CEO of the Society for Women's Health Research. SWHR is a more than 30-year-old national nonprofit dedicated to promoting research on sex differences in disease and improving women's health through science, policy, and education. And most notable for today's event, we're the administrative home of the Coalition to Advance Maternal Therapeutics. Before we move into today's program, I want to just review a few details and housekeeping notes. First, I'd like to thank the Coalition's corporate members whose support has made this event possible: Biogen, Covis Pharma, Janssen, and UCB. We appreciate your support. Please note that today's web event is being recorded. We will post it online. We'll be able to send the recording out as well as any additional resources mentioned in the follow-up email to all registrants. All participants have been muted and cameras have been turned off. This is intentional to highlight our speakers today. To ask a question to the panelists, please use the Zoom Q&A function. Alternatively, you could use the chat function. We will ask questions at the end of the event following the panelists' presentations. If you need technical assistance, please write that in the chat function. Just know that we have limited technical assistance available and we do our best to make sure that we are responsive. So as I mentioned, today's national webinar and congressional briefing is being hosted by SWHR in our capacity as the administrative home for the Coalition to Advance Maternal Therapeutics. And the coalition itself was founded in 2014 and was launched to better understand the safety and efficacy of prescription drugs, therapeutics, and vaccines used during pregnancy and breastfeeding. And Drew will discuss this more in his remarks today, but the coalition was founded by a group of organizations who recognized the tremendous need to understand the effect of drugs on a woman and her pregnancy and the ways in which pregnancy may alter the uptake, metabolism, and effect of medication. And importantly, without reliable data, people who are pregnant or nursing may decide to stop taking necessary medications, increasing the risk for both mother and child. As part of its work, the coalition successfully advocated for the creation of a federal task force, which we call PregLac. It's the task force specific to research in pregnant women and lactating women to identify and address gaps in knowledge regarding safe and effective therapies and vaccines for pregnant and lactating women. And today, our member organizations remain committed to raising awareness among stakeholders about the need to include pregnant and lactating populations in clinical trials where appropriate, to close our gaps in knowledge and ultimately improve the health of women and their families. It's due to that mission that we are here today. We have a stellar panel of experts who are going to discuss the concerns and considerations for including these populations in research. So I will go through and introduce the panelists and our moderator, and then I'll turn it over to him. So we have Dr. Christina Bucci-Redwig, who has over 20 years of pharmaceutical industry experience with roles in clinical development and medical affairs, as well as regulatory and development policy. She was responsible for the oversight and registration of global clinical development programs. She has developed and implemented clinical programs as a global medical director for pediatric and women's health in phase 2 and 3, including those with pediatric regulatory obligations in the EU and the US. She is widely regarded for her negotiating skills in adult and pediatric drug development, as well as health policy and international regulatory consensus building. She has been actively involved in many external organizations, including the US National Advisory Council for Child Health and Human Development. We also have Drew Hatter, who is our moderator for today's event. He's a federal affairs strategist at the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, or ACOG, and as a member of ACOG's government affairs team, Drew advocates to federal legislators and government officials for legislation and policy critical to improving women's health, such as those pertaining to the physician workforce, federal appropriations, health information technology, and the inclusion of pregnant and lactating populations in federal research. We have Dr. Erin Pavlak, who joined the Eunice Kennedy Shriver National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, or NICHD, as its obstetric and pediatric pharmacology and therapeutics branch chief in 2019. His long-term research interests and experience include drug discovery and preclinical development, pharmacogenomics, and mathematical modeling, especially how these approaches can be applied across multiple therapeutic areas. Dr. Layla Sahin is an obstetrician gynecologist and serves as the Deputy Director for Safety in the Division of Pediatrics and Maternal Health in the Office of New Drugs at the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at the FDA, where she oversees pregnancy and lactation safety activities and leads various maternal health-related scientific and regulatory policy initiatives. And last but not least, we have Dr. Kathy Spong, who is the Paul C. McDonald Distinguished Chair in Obstetrics and Gynecology at the University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center. She is professor and chair of the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology and the chief of the Division of Maternal Fetal Medicine. Among her areas of expertise are maternal and child health, emphasizing prematurity, fetal complication, and improving child outcomes. One of her major research interests has been the developing fetus. She has also served on several professional and federal boards, including serving as the inaugural chair of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services PregLac Task Force. With all of that, and I apologize for going through that quickly, but we have a meaty conversation. I will turn it over to Drew to moderate today's event.
Thank you very much. And, really excited to be here today to help moderate as we hear from our fantastic panelists on this incredibly important issue. So to kick our discussion off, I know some of this was covered, but just want to provide a very quick overview, kind of a level set for our conversation. So each year, over 3.5 million individuals in the United States give birth and nearly 3 million breastfeed their infants. However, historically, pregnant and lactating individuals have been and continue to be excluded from clinical trials. And as a result, not enough is known about the effect of most medications and therapeutics during pregnancy. In an effort to address this problem, as was mentioned, Congress established the PregLac Task Force in 2016 to identify and address some of the gaps in knowledge regarding safe and effective therapies, vaccines for pregnant and lactating individuals. PregLac did release a report in 2018 that included detailed recommendations along with an additional implementation report that was released back in 2020. However, PregLac's charter did expire in March of 2021. And despite this invaluable work that was done by the task force, this vulnerable population is still routinely excluded from clinical trials and research. Without reliable data, those who are pregnant or nursing may decide to stop taking necessary medications, as was mentioned, and in other cases may choose to not initiate breastfeeding or may wean earlier than desired, since of a lack of information. As an example, a very relevant example, unfortunately, during the COVID-19 pandemic, clinical trials for treatments and vaccines largely excluded pregnant and lactating individuals, leaving them and their clinicians without clear evidence on the safety and the efficacy to guide clinical decision-making. Furthermore, as our clinicians struggle to make clear evidence-based recommendations to their patients, online misinformation just only filled that void. Much of the misinformation that's surrounding the COVID-19 vaccines impacts on reproductive health could have been more effectively dispelled if pregnant and lactating individuals had been included in the vaccine clinical trials. Lack of clinical trial data on pregnant and lactating individuals created significant uncertainty about the safety of vaccinating these populations, which again, resulting in many foregoing the vaccines to detrimental effect and allowing for misinformation. Unfortunately, pregnant and lactating individuals still are routinely excluded from many COVID-19 vaccine therapeutic trials, among other things, despite the very clear necessity for collecting complete data and inspiring confidence in the vaccines among all eligible populations. So quite simply put here, we can and we must do better for pregnant and lactating individuals, and more work is needed to ensure that this vulnerable population is protected through research and not from research. So again, great to be here. I won't go on any further there, but to move into our discussion here, and I can give our panelists just a second to come on camera. Fantastic. Great to see you all here today. So just to move into our discussion here, and again, this is just an open discussion. I'm initially gonna, call out some folks, but please feel free to chime in, and that's what this is all about. So Dr. Sahin, why why don't we start with you? We've given a bit of context here, a bit of high level overview, but I'm wondering why haven't pregnant lactating individuals historically been included in clinical trials? And for all the folks on here, if you want to highlight some of the progress that has been made, some of the positives there, and also if some time, some of the lessons learned, as I mentioned from the COVID-19 pandemic as well.
Thanks, Drew. Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to thank the organizers for the opportunity to be part of this really important panel, and thanks for everybody who's online and listening and participating today. So I think that fundamentally, one of the most important reasons going back in history as to why there has been this long history of exclusion of pregnant and lactating individuals in clinical trials is because of a teratogenic drug called thalidomide. Thalidomide was marketed in the 1950s outside the US. And then when the application came to the FDA in 1960, there was a medical officer who was reviewing the application named Frances Kelsey, and she felt that the application was really lacking in terms of safety and efficacy data. So she refused to approve that drug in the US. And because of her refusal to do that, that really averted the introduction of thalidomide into the US and prevented the tragedy that occurred outside the US in terms of babies that were born with significant limb defects. And so on the one hand, we see Frances Kelsey as a hero because of the strong scientific judgment that she exerted and the action that she took. And the resultant regulations in terms of drug development that then ensued. But on the other hand, the whole issue of thalidomide really created this background of a culture of fear and caution. And even though it's been over 60 years since that tragedy occurred, it has had a profound impact on the way that we look at conducting clinical trials in pregnant women. So I just wanted to provide a little bit of that background history.
Fantastic. Much appreciated. Anybody else like to chime in there?
Yeah, Drew, I think I agree with Layla that thalidomide certainly has clouded the waters and been something that we've actively thought about. I will say, however, that pregnant and lactating women are active participants in research, and there's a robust history going back decades of research going on in pregnant and lactating women that is done well, and women want to participate in that research, and they want that data, because without that data, then the medications and therapies that are given to them without evidence to support its use. And I think a big component of the reason why women are not included in clinical trials is because at present, as Dr. Sahin mentioned, it is an automatic exclusion, right? That is the first thing, is that those two populations are excluded, and there is no need to justify why they're excluded. They're simply excluded. There have been movements in other groups, as examples, women, children, the elderly, where if you are going to exclude them from a clinical trial at the NIH, you must document and justify why you're excluding those groups. But there is no requirement to document why you're going to exclude pregnant or lactating women. And the difficulty then is the clinicians, the practitioners, those of us seeing patients and talking with them every day, we have limited evidence to provide to those patients and those women as to, what the evidence is for that therapy that we are prescribing to them. I know that you were asking a little bit about how much progress has been made, and I would like to say that there's been more. This has been an issue that's been going back since the 1980s. There have been a number of different professional groups and organizations prior to PregLac that have really taken this on and tried to include women and then pregnant women and lactating women in research. We did a study back in 2018 before the initial recommendations were put out, looking at how many were explicitly excluded, how many pregnant women and lactating women were explicitly excluded. And we found that it was around 70% for pregnant individuals and around 50% for lactating individuals. We redid that same analysis in January of this year and found even with PregLac's recommendations, really the needle has not been moved. And again, rather the same number of participants, pregnant women and lactating women, are excluded from clinical trials and studies.
Fantastic, and really appreciate the point that you made there about the need to have the justification and readily available for why they may be excluded. So would anybody else like to jump in on this question?
Yeah, I'd say there has been some progress. I mean, an important movement has been the removal of pregnant women as a vulnerable population from the common rule. But as I think came up, one of the things that I'd like to emphasize is, we know that pregnant and lactating persons can be included safely in clinical trials as appropriate. I would say not everybody knows that. The NICHD and other networks at the NIH have focused on the study of pregnant and lactating persons. I think an important issue is communicating and educating the broader research endeavor, clinical trial research endeavor, that you can include pregnant and lactating women in trials. And in fact, pregnant and lactating persons do want to be involved in those trials. So education is a critical component. And I'm glad Dr. Spong brought up the inclusion at the NIH. I would say if you look at the NIH inclusion categories, there's not even an inclusion category for pregnancy or lactation. So as well as not having to justify why they would be excluded from a clinical trial, we don't have a very good tracking tool. I'm sure it involves a lot of manual curation to go through and find studies that are actively including or excluding. So, but we lack that inclusion criteria right now.
Absolutely. Perfect. Any other points there? Fantastic. Well, I think kind of leading off of that as well, kind of wondering more about, because we've talked about kind of the history here of why they've been excluded, included at times, lacking justifications, but kind of pulling that all together, what then exists some of the greatest misconceptions when it comes to including pregnant and lactating populations in research? Dr. Bucci-Ratwig, we can start with you here, but again, folks, please feel free to chime in.
Thanks, Drew. And actually, some of the other panelists are probably better suited to answer this question. But I think from an industry perspective, and I want to go to Layla's comments from before, it's important to understand that over the course of the last decade, since the 1960s, the lens through which we've looked at the pregnant population for research, in particular for medicines development, has been largely through a safety lens. And the reality is pregnant women, many of them become pregnant with comorbid conditions. And there is a real need for us to be evaluating these patients from an efficacy lens. We do know there's plenty of research to tell us that the better we manage mom's disease, the better her outcomes during pregnancy. The better we manage mom's disease, the better the outcomes for the developing fetus and the ultimate infant. So there's a real opportunity here. And I think to Kathy's point, women are on medications. They're not only potentially willing participants, they're actually on these medications. So we have real opportunities to learn from the experience we have, either from anecdote or clinical practice, or from those medications which have been developed in situations where there is a definitive need, because otherwise mom's outcomes would be significantly altered. But there's certainly opportunities for us to move forward and find ways that we can really pragmatically obtain information that better informs clinicians' ability to prescribe the right therapies at the right dose for those patients.
Yes, Dr. Spong.
And let me just add on, and I agree with everything that's just been said. Thank you, Christina. I think an important point that maybe not everyone realizes as to why can't we just use what's the studies that are in non-pregnant women, right, or non-lactating women. Why do we need studies in pregnant lactating women? And if I can just take a moment to digress on why that's important. In pregnancy, a woman's physiology changes dramatically, right? Her blood volume doubles during pregnancy. The binding proteins in her blood, which are important for different medications, changes. Her GI transit time changes, which is important for the metabolism of the drugs. Her renal function, her kidney function, and excretion of drugs changes. So across pregnancy and similarly across lactation, a woman's physiology changes. So it might be that the medication that she was on or the dosing that was needed, whether it's in spacing or in amount, needs to change for it to remain effective during pregnancy. And so it's really important for us to understand for these therapies how to best optimize their use during pregnancy. And I think that that's not always clearly understood.
Dr. Sahin.
Yeah, thanks. So I think that there has been an evolution in thinking. I think that we have gone from this, culture of fear and focusing strictly on risk and safety to the point where we are now, where we've all come to the point where we recognize that we can't be hiding in fear anymore, that we have to, head on confront the need to do these studies. And so now the question is not, do we do the studies, but the question is, how do we do these studies? How do we, account for risk mitigation? How do we get the necessary studies before we start to include pregnant and lactating individuals in clinical trials? So I think now I think there has been progress, and I think that we are at an exciting time now where we are having these types of collaborative discussions to try to move forward and address these challenges head on.
Dr. Pollack. I think we have you on mute there, Dr. Pollack.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I think one of the greatest misconceptions that comes up in terms of including pregnant and lactating persons in clinical research, this was hit on before, but that's actually protecting them, right? I think we recognize, and as has been said, medications, when they come out, they're going to be used in pregnant and lactating persons, at a broad level. There's efficacy to consider, and untreated disease during pregnancy has negative outcomes for both the mother and the child, right? So I think we need to sort of really reframe it as I believe you said earlier, we need to protect pregnant and lactating persons through research and not from research, right? And in terms of, there are ways that we have a fairly good understanding of not everything, but a lot of the physiological changes that occur in pregnancy. And there's a lot of computational models. There's a lot of technical terms, pharmacometrics and physiological-based pharmacokinetic models that can help us guide and identify a drug that is a dose of a medication that's very likely to be safe, for initial clinical trials. So there are a lot of tools available now to help get to that initial study design so that it can be as safe as possible when we go, a first in pregnancy or a first in lactation for a medication.
No, absolutely. And I think a lot of the comments there in that question actually really well tease up kind of what I was hoping to discuss next, talking a lot about, we've kind of talked where we have been, what are some of the challenges, what are some of the misconceptions, but, I'm curious now looking forward, as was mentioned, what steps can researchers take? And I know we've mentioned there has been progress, are taking steps, but, maybe expound more a bit on what steps can researchers take to ensure the appropriate inclusion of this population? And I think really importantly as well, and Dr. Pollack, I'm going to turn to you first, but I think everybody on this call potentially has quite a bit of thoughts here, but I think particularly helpful is what are some of the resources that are available for assisting researchers?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And this is definitely something we've been thinking about at the NICHD as we follow up on some of the recommendations from the PregLac Task Force. One, we have established a consortium called the Maternal and Pediatric Precision and Therapeutics Hub. I'll put the link in chat for the notes later. The MPrint Hub is very much focused on using tools and data to develop items that can be used to help get to appropriate dosing in those clinical trials. I had mentioned those mathematical models. The MPrint Hub has a variety of expertise and skills in that, as well as access to those core facilities. So if individuals are looking for guidance on how women women could be safely included in those, while pregnant could be safely included in clinical trials, it could feel free to reach out to access those. We also have a funding opportunity announcement out for R25s for education. So we are soliciting for grant applications that may help with some of that education gap. So we want to also facilitate the development of educational tools. Lastly, I do want to highlight one of the things that the NICHD has undertaken is a revamp of our multi-site clinical trial infrastructure. One of those networks is the Maternal Fetal Medicine Unit Network, as well as associated clinical trials for that. So now for multi-site clinical trials, the NICHD has moved to a process where we have concept proposals that come in. So that's where we can engage early with investigators to see what networks are appropriate, what are parameters that could be taken, for conducting conducting trials through our networks in pregnant and lactating individuals. And this is now open to the broader scientific community.
Yes, Dr. Bucci-Ritwig.
Sure, Drew. And just to add to Erin's points, I think one of the underutilized tools that is readily available to us right now is broader acceptability of using methods such as quantitative mathematical modeling to help us get to an appropriate dose for patients. And so for those who aren't familiar, this is a method of using all of the data that's currently available, either in animal models or in human data that's been generated, and using what we know as the kind of the standard or the expected physiologic response of the population. And so I think Kathy highlighted that during the course of pregnancy, physiology does evolve. So you have to have a clear understanding of that physiology at the point that you're going to be studying the patient to better predict a dose. I think too often there's an assumption that a dedicated study has to be done. Dedicated studies take time. Where you can actually potentially get to starting doses faster because you need to rely on other information that's been generated. So I think that that's another tool that is readily available to us in use. It's used in all stages of medicine's development, from discovery all the way to the point of confirmatory studies in medicine's development today. And certainly it is a space that has been much more readily discussed within the pediatric community too, as a model of a vulnerable population where it's often difficult to recruit patients into trials, and we need to take advantage of the data that's already been generated that we can tap into to predict what our expected response would be, and then conduct a smaller confirmatory study for that population. So I think that's another really important tool that people need to begin to talk about and get into their lexicon of understanding is a reasonable approach for us to take.
Fantastic. And Dr. Spahn.
Thank you. And just a shout out for Erin's comment on the Maternal Fetal Medicine Unit Network and other networks that NICHD supports. These have a long and robust history of demonstrating that it is clearly possible to do research in these populations, and women, are more than happy to participate in research to better understand conditions and to improve the evidence base for their care. I think as you think about trying to figure out how do we ensure appropriate inclusion, I think you have to think about different types of studies, right? So there are certainly some studies that are specific to pregnant women or specific to lactating women. And that's one area where you kind of go down, what is the question, and how do I ensure that that population is interested in participating? How do I communicate with them? And then how do we do that study? The second question is how, on the studies that aren't necessarily targeting pregnant or lactating women, is it appropriate to include or to exclude pregnant lactating women from those studies, and how do we walk through that, and what data do we need to gather, and how do we ensure that if it's possible that we in fact can include those populations and get the data that we need. I think one of the things that was mentioned earlier was communication and public health awareness, that it is certainly appropriate and important to do these studies. And I think one of the things that PregLec, I remember, talked quite a bit about was trying to focus on public awareness campaigns on the importance of doing research in these populations. I think those are all opportunities.
Drew, Kathy always says things that triggered new thoughts in my mind, but I think one of the other really important opportunities here is this ability to marry obstetrical research structures with therapeutic area specific research structures. What do I mean by that? Typically, when companies are conducting studies, let's say, for example, with anti-epileptics for women who may have seizures, it's neurologists or neurology clinics or anti-epileptic clinics, which are the primary places where these research centers are going to be to evaluate these potential therapies. We don't tend to have obstetricians that are intertwined with those sites for us to have closer or easier access in order to recruit those patients for trials. So I think a real opportunity too, as we move forward, and this is clearly even bigger than just this topic, is how we're thoughtful about intertwining research structures that can really help support each other to move more efficiently and more effectively in generating data for populations.
Christina is so elegant in what she says. I completely agree with her. And I think that that is a way, you know, there's a lot of times when, you know, we need to use a certain medication in a pregnant woman, and she's going to be on that medication. So why not capture that data so that we can then create that evidence? I think it's a win-win. And I agree with you, Christine. If we could link the groups together, it would be fantastic.
Fantastic. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk about all the steps that are being taken, can be taken, and then really finishing on that point of collaboration and just a really good piece there. But kind of, I guess, even now further building upon that, we've kind of talked about steps. I think we've alluded to some of this a little bit early on in the conversation. I know the common rule was mentioned. We've talked a little bit about having justifications for excluding these populations, but really wanted to talk a little bit more about if there are any federal policies, or specifically discuss some federal policies that may be in place that, you know, impede our ability to appropriately study these populations, and how we might be able to modify them or find ways to foster that collaboration, or a lot of the things that we've discussed. And Dr. Spong, I'm going to start with you.
All right. So clearly, you know, going back to what Dr. Sahin said in the beginning, you know, that there's a unique relationship in pregnancy and in lactating women that have resulted in federal regulations and guidance and rules really aimed to protect the woman, the fetus, or the child. And I will say that some of these rules have been identified as barriers to research, and I'll just kind of outline some of those that came up during the PregLac discussions. The common rule is one of those, and the common rule requires the consent of both the pregnant woman and the baby's father if the research holds the prospect of direct benefit solely to the fetus. That contrasts with once the baby is born. Once the baby is born, if there's research that's got the prospect of the benefit of the child, it only requires single parent consent. So there's a discrepancy there that potentially could hinder research to benefit the fetus, because you'd have to have both parents consenting in pregnancy. I think the second is in the common rule as well, there's an option for research on children where the risk is a minor increase over minimal risk, but there is no provision for the pregnant woman. And, you know, times have changed since these rules were initially made. There's autonomy of pregnant women, there's evolution of family structures. I think, you know, there's a question of whether maternal consent alone and the option of minor increase over minimal risk could potentially be added to the common rule.
Dr. Zine.
Okay, so I think the way that you asked the question is interesting, and I think I'm going to respond to it in a different way. I think the lack of policies may be a hindrance here. I think there's no requirements to do any kind of studies in pregnant or lactating women. So I think that pregnant and lactating populations, you know, are completely left behind in terms of drug development, and so all these products are approved or brought to market, and the only thing that's there is animal data. And then healthcare providers and patients have to make important decisions about whether to prescribe, whether to take a medication based on animal data. And so where are pregnant and lactating women in this equation? And so I think it's the lack of policies you know, that's one issue. In terms of advancing some policies. So the common rule was mentioned. I think Erin mentioned that the common rule deleted reference to pregnant women as a vulnerable population. And now I just wanted to make everybody aware that FDA also published a proposed rule in September to also remove reference to pregnant women as a vulnerable population from its own human subject protection regulations. So I think that's a good step forward.
Yes, Dr. Pucci-Redwig.
I think Layla knew I was going to respond to her. So I think one of the questions about policy is what kind of policy? And I think we've got to be a little bit cautious here, because for the majority of therapies, when they're approved, so when they're first authorized, unless there is a contraindication for use in pregnancy, they are approved for use in pregnancy. And I think a lot of people don't understand that. It is a very important distinction. So yes, oftentimes for many of the new therapies, new meaning that there's not another drug from within that class of drugs that's been authorized. There is a set of non-clinical data which might need to be generated. The timing of conducting those studies in order to be able to include pregnant women may become complex. And I'm choosing my words carefully, obviously, because it may become complex. It may not become complex, but for some of those, it may become complex. And therefore, at the point at which the information is being submitted to the agency, if that information is considered sufficient enough to be able to be used for making predictions or assumptions about the way that drug is going to work in the pregnant population, it is also approved for use in pregnancy. So it's really important. We see this, and I saw it even in the suggested comments here. Why not put something in place like you have for pediatrics? Pediatrics is a different situation. The majority of drugs are not approved for use in pediatrics at the time of their marketing authorization. There is no labeling, and the labels very clearly say that the data has not been generated for use. They typically say they're authorized for use at either 16 or 18 and older. So it's not the same scenario, and we need to ensure that conversations around policy include what pragmatic approaches could help generate just that sufficient additional information to really be able to reassure prescribers that the dose they're using is effective for mom and not going to be a risk for the baby. Okay, so I think that it's really important to provide that distinction, because there are important enough differences that we have to think differently about the type of policy makes sense for this population.
No, fantastic. I think that's absolutely fantastic. And, I think, does anybody else have any thoughts kind of on that question there?
I'll just add a little bit, in terms of the question, in terms of impediment to study populations and at the policy level, I think as we've sort of mentioned, at the NIH, I don't think there's certainly not much that impedes the research. I think what we need to do are think about ways to enable and encourage at the policy level, and that includes, I think, tracking, better when NIH studies are looking at inclusion of pregnant and lactating persons as an upfront thought and consideration, as opposed to not being tracked or looked at. Similar to how pediatrics and women in general were many years ago.
Absolutely. I think that's another fantastic point. So, we have about 20 minutes left here, and I know we wanted to leave some time for the Q&A. We actually have quite a robust Q&A coming in. But before we do that, and since we have some time, just wanted to give a kind of a final opportunity here, closing out this part of the discussion. If folks had anything that comes to mind they'd like to mention or discuss, kind of before we move into some questions from the audience. And if not, that's fine too. Dr. Steen, did you have something?
I don't know. I was just going to say, right, there may be, of course, differences of opinion on the industry side versus the FDA side. I think that's expected. That's okay. But I really appreciate these types of opportunities for us to get together, to have these kinds of conversations. And I think that this is helpful in terms of moving this field forward. So thank you.
Dr. Spahn.
Yeah, I think that, this is a really important topic, and this is a topic that's been built upon decades and decades of different groups, and women, and then pregnant women and lactating women all trying to be included in research, I think, and to provide that evidence base. And I think it's really wonderful to be able to have both government and industry and active practitioners together. We're all actually after the same thing. I know that we all want that better data, and we all want to be able to provide that evidence for pregnant and lactating women so that we can best treat them appropriately. I think we all recognize that without that data, the healthcare providers are left with really undesirable options. You're taking a product without the knowledge, and you may not be treating the condition adequately. And I think, that's not where any of us want to be. I think we're all on the same page, regardless of where we come from. And I really appreciate the opportunity to have this dialogue with our colleagues and to share this information with everyone.
Dr. Pollack.
And I just want to add, I think one particularly great approach that we can take for generating and building up a data set for use of drugs that are safe during pregnancy and lactation is to better leverage pregnancy registries, real-world data approaches, pragmatic trials, and linkage of mother-baby data, electronic healthcare records. And there are efforts going on, within the government and others to advance those. But I think pregnancy registries and opportunistic pragmatic trials is going to be really important for building up our collective knowledge base.
Fantastic. So unless there's any other kind of closing comments here, not that we're done yet. We have quite a few questions from the audience. So actually pretty good timing here. Ruchi Retwig, I know you mentioned talking about the pediatric space and kind of relating that. So we actually do have a question from the audience, asking for folks to comment on the need for regulation in the pregnancy and lactation space to require studies like has been done for pediatrics. So maybe if there's more to expound upon in that area for folks.
Yeah, sure. I saw Tacey's comment. Thanks for that comment, Tacey. So as I said, the majority of products approved for use at the time of marketing authorization do not include an indication that would include the pediatric population. The vast majority include populations older than the age of 16, versus the majority of medicines newly approved by the agency, unless they are contraindicated for use in pregnancy, consider the pregnant population to be within the indication for use statement. So under the Pediatric Research Equity Act, there is a requirement to conduct or to complete studies in a pediatric population. The average lag time between the first authorization of an adult product to a pediatric product has remained unchanged at about 9 years, even since the institution of the Pediatric Research Equity Act. A huge step back for pregnant women would be if the labels had to start including a no-use statement at the time of authorization because they had to complete clinical studies in the pregnant population for use. So when I talk about pragmatic policy solutions, we have to think about unintended negative consequences of certain approaches. And that's why I said I think certain pragmatic approaches, such as what is the necessary information to adequately inform on dose, to adequately inform on efficacy for those appropriate therapies where we know this therapy is going to be used in that pregnant population and could be of value to have that information, hopefully from day one or minimally as soon as possible to day one of the marketing authorization. So it's really important to think about the application of policy because it can in fact have consequences that would delay access. And certainly that would be a step back from us. That's the exact opposite of what we're looking to do here.
This is Layla. I just wanted to clarify. I don't think that the intent is to include a statement in labeling that says that this drug is not approved for use in pregnant or lactating individuals. I think that what we need to start talking about is, okay, is this drug going to be used in these populations? And if it is, then how are we going to get the data that we need?
Yeah, and to that end, Layla and I are 100% in agreement. It's people, I think, have a misperception about PREA just being able to be reproduced and repurposed for pregnancy. And that approach is likely not to be very helpful.
And as a clinician, I agree wholeheartedly.
Fantastic. So I think onto another question that we have here, if you'll just give me 1 second. I think talking more about timeline and maybe logistically here, we have some folks wondering what is the appropriate time for a pregnancy trial during the drug development process, at least as I understand that there.
I'll start to answer, but I don't think I'm the bottom line on this one. I think this is a true example of a it depends, which is really not helpful to the person who asked the question. It's entirely dependent on the mechanism of the drug that's being developed and how much we know about that mechanism. Is this a novel mechanism, meaning it's never been studied in humans before? Or is it a mechanism where we have other products that have been approved or have decades of experience and we've got a pretty good understanding of that profile, both in pregnant populations and or potential risk to the developing fetus? I think those are all parts of the question. And again, I caution, I'm not convinced that for every new medicine, there's a need for a dedicated pregnancy study. And I don't think that that's what my colleagues on this panel are saying. The question is, at what point could we, for each individual therapy being assessed, consider the inclusion of pregnant patients within the development program, meaning that they don't have an exclusion in the protocol. They're actually allowed to be included within the protocol. So again, unfortunately, I apologize that it's a not so satisfactory answer, but I do think a lot of it is dependent on the circumstances of the disease of development and the mechanism of development.
Dr. Spong.
Yeah, I agree completely. And I want to just add a little bit to that. It depends also on what the drug is being developed for, right? So if the drug is being developed for a condition that could affect pregnant or non-pregnant people versus if it's a pregnancy specific drug, of course, that's going to be incredibly different as well. And I'll take the moment there to just highlight that the pipeline for pregnancy specific drugs is incredibly small. And that is something else that needs to be worked on, where there are conditions in pregnancy that could benefit from therapeutic options, but yet that pipeline is incredibly small.
And Dr. Pollack.
Yeah, I'm going to restate a bit, I think, but a little bit differently. You know, I think when we know enough that we feel we can go forward safely, and not just feel, but have some modeling. And the reason I restate it that way is I think there is a lot that we know about various mechanisms, drug classes, et cetera, as Christina mentioned. There are different preclinical models, computational, microphysiological systems, et cetera, that can get us more data about how certain drugs and mechanisms may act during pregnancy or during lactation. So I think really doing a better job at pulling these tools together, understanding how they can work, understanding how they can inform regulatory decisions. I think that's going to be really important for providing tools to the clinical trialists so that they can better know when and make very informed decisions about when to start including pregnant and lactating persons in the drug development pipeline.
And just to add to what everybody else has said, related to this being a kind of case-by-case basis with all these considerations, I think, one example that we saw was during the COVID-19 pandemic. So I think when you have a clear situation where it's a life-threatening disease, there's no available therapeutic options, I think, that's pretty clear where you would want to be including pregnant and lactating individuals in phase 3 clinical trials.
Fantastic. So I think kind of an interesting and maybe a bit of a detailed question here, but we have somebody that's wondering what research is available that documents who maybe exactly who the pregnant individuals are who participate in clinical trials. And I think kind of, asking more about demographics here and wondering if there are particular individuals that are more likely than others to participate and how that may impact study results.
Yes, I can start with that. And I think what the question is trying to get at is generalizability, right? Is the population, is the person who agrees to participate in a clinical trial different from the general population? And that's always been a question. And it raises, as was described earlier, the importance of different types of research designs, right? And there are ways to get around this idea of selection bias where a woman who participates in a clinical trial may not be representative of the entire population. I think it's a really important piece, and I think that there are different study methods in ways to do that. And I don't think it negates the importance of still doing clinical trials, but I think study design and understanding the impact then of those results of that study on the generalizable population, again, studying the impact of then that therapy. So for example, say you wanted to identify actually a drug in pregnancy, perhaps to prevent preterm birth. If you were to do that study and you're concerned that perhaps those who participated may not be generalizable, it's important to do those implementation studies to evaluate the effect of that drug once it is used, if it were to be found to be effective.
There was a meeting that was conducted by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine in June, and this was a topic that was covered there, and there were representatives, patient representatives, and investigators who were doing these studies, and one of the suggestions that they provided was that a lot of these types of studies tend to be done in academic centers. And so they made the point that investigators have to make the effort to go out into the community and find the patients and not just, be limited to the typical patients, the high socioeconomic status patients who typically participate in clinical trials, but to really make that effort to go into the communities, go into rural areas. So take the studies to the patients, and if you need to go out into those rural areas and draw the blood samples, for example, for whatever you're doing, a lactation study or a PK study. So basically go to the patient rather than, always requiring the patient to come to the academic center.
And Dr. Pollack.
Yeah, I just want to really echo, we really need to think about inclusion and diversity as we start to enhance recruitment of, individuals that are pregnant and lactating in clinical trials. The NICHD and others at the NIH oversee a registry called PregSource, which is a great source to find individuals that are interested in understanding their pregnancies and contributing ever. The NIH also supports an initiative called Implementing a Maternal Health and Pregnancy Outcomes Vision for Everyone, or the IMPROVE initiative, which is exactly focused on this diversity and equity, racial, rural versus urban, age, and disability as well are things that we need to take into considerations in terms of inclusion in trials. Because if we want results to be as generalizable as possible, we need to be as inclusive as possible when we generate the data and evidence to make decisions.
Fantastic. So another question that we have here, if you'll just give me 1 second so I can orient myself. Yeah, so we had another interesting question, wondering if there are any other countries that have a more active drug, have more active or available drug info on, for those with, for pregnant and lactating individuals, and they know it would be helpful to maybe utilize or learn, some from other places.
I can talk a little bit about a new collaboration that's going to be getting off the ground soon. So the International Council on Harmonization will be launching the development of a guidance on clinical trials in pregnant and lactating individuals that will include representatives globally across, so FDA, European Medicines Agency, MHRA, and all other regulatory agencies, also including representation from industry, so bio, pharma, FPA. So this will be launching sometime, I think, in the new year. And so this is something that we're really excited about, because this is a great opportunity for stakeholders around the world to get together to start to have these important conversations and try to align our thinking on how to get these studies done.
Yes.
Yeah, and I can only echo Layla's enthusiasm for E21. It's going to be a little bit of a long slog, but the fact that this international consensus body from agencies from around the globe wanted to take up this topic tells us that there is a definitive need, yes. I think one of the other areas that we could look to is within Europe. There is the Innovative Health Initiative, IHI, which has a conception project, which is a joint public-private partnership, which is looking to understand safety and medication use in pregnancy. So this has been in place now for a few years. There's actually quite a few work packages that are taking place. And I do know that there are some collaborators from within the United States who've been active in some of those work packages as well. So, well, I wish I could say that there are regions around the globe that we could tap into as a best practice. All of the regions around the globe really need to move these principles forward of a broader inclusion of pregnant patients in our clinical research.
Fantastic. So I think, we're drawing close to the end here, but I think we have time for one more question here. So we have somebody that's wondering if our panelists can describe what resources FDA or others, so open it to everybody, may offer to academic researchers who wish to conduct research in pregnant people, and to help them really navigate the many steps. I know that this individual notes that it can be challenging for those that don't have experienced people developing or testing a specific product, or maybe have that funding available. So maybe kind of to wrap us up here, maybe folks can talk about some of the ways that, I know we've talked a lot about resources, but some help there.
Well, FDA has published several guidances, inclusion of pregnant women in clinical trials. We published a PK studies guidance. There's a lactation studies guidances. So there are a lot of FDA guidances that will be helpful in this area.
There's also a lot of friendly FDA people who will help you and answer your questions as you are trying to navigate this very complex area.
Yes, Dr. Pollack.
Yeah, and I'll bring up the Maternal and Pediatric Precision and Therapeutics Hub again as a research for some technical aspects to that. And I also want to also say there's a lot of friendly and passionate people at NICHD and the entire NIH that want more inclusion of pregnant and lactating persons. So please reach out to your NIH program officer, your NICHD program officer for assistance there. The other thing that I'm sort of taking a takeaway from this meeting is having some more educational tools and guides for a variety of researchers, nurse practitioners, lactation consultants, everybody within the entire endeavor to help them navigate this space will be very, very valuable.
Fantastic. Any last thoughts on that? Fantastic. Well, I also, we're pretty much at time here, but just one last check here. Are there any final thoughts, any last pearls of wisdom that folks might want to share before we kind of close our event here? Yes.
Drew, I'll be really quick. I'm hopeful that what all of you will take away from this is you see 4 different sectors represented here in this call. We're all very passionate about this topic, and we're looking to find ways to collaborate together. We believe that we can find solutions for the future. So I think as long as we can keep this dialogue open and continue to have the support of all of you on the line, we're going to be able to be successful here for this space.
Dr. Spong.
And to add on to that, this is an area that affects everyone, right? We were all in some ways attached to a pregnant woman at some point. And I think it's really vital for us and for our ability to best care for pregnant women and lactating women to be able to create this evidence. And you see from this discussion, there is passion across all sectors to do this. And I think it's a really wonderful opportunity to advance women's health.
Yeah, I think that we all recognize that it's very challenging work, but I think, right, I hope that we've demonstrated that all of us here are very passionate about this, and we are all dedicated to moving forward. So thank you for the opportunity to participate today.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, just to, again, the interest, the passion is here across the board. You know, I think the need, especially, you know, as Kathy mentioned, for treatment of pregnancy conditions themselves is very high. And I think that there's a lot within reach there. It's just going to take the will and resources to really just, and commitment to get this to happen, but it's very doable and it's very possible.
Fantastic. And I think that's the perfect note to end on. And I just want to thank again all of our wonderful panelists. I know others probably feel the same, but I feel lucky to have been here and learned so much during this hour. So just want to remind folks, this is the first briefing in a 3-part series that we will have on this incredibly important topic. This will be followed by pregnant and lactating populations in research, how leaving these populations out leaves them behind in January of next year. And then our third briefing being Preg-Lac then and now, where we are and where we're going in February. So, you know, as a reminder, this briefing was recorded, will be uploaded so folks can review and think on this more. But again, just thank you to all of our panelists for being here and for everybody in attendance for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you.